So welcome everyone. Today's session is on study rules. Really the goal being to implement study rules in your protocols, and that will result in hopefully better trials, better data coming back. So we'll talk about how to get started, some tips and tricks for kind of a beginner's aspect of study rules and just how to get going with them. There's a lot of options. You can go really deep into study rules, but I think to get started first, you want to start simple, and so that's kind of our goal today is start with the basics and build from there. So just first to kind of set the stage as to why you'd want to use study rules, why would they matter? And so for protocol writing, the study rules are really the best way to communicate any requirements and information that is a must to the trialist. So a very clear, concise way to provide a list of what absolutely needs to be filled in. We'll also see later that you can have some less strict rules to say, hey, I would like this information, but I don't strictly need it. So there's a few different levels to that communication that you can provide. And then you can also use study rules to kind of manage any important information, whether it's confidential information that needs to be hidden from the trialist or from others, or to lock information. Once it's been entered into the study, this cannot change. It's not valid to change it. So let's lock that particular piece of information so it's not editable later on down the road. And so those are kind of the primary reasons, primary functionality that study rules bring to the table, and they can really strengthen then the information that you get back in those trials by using them. Then on the trialist side, if you are a trialist wondering, well, that's great, but why would it matter for me? Even a trialist can get in on the action with their own rules if they aren't seeing them in the protocol that they're receiving. They can still be used by an individual as a great self-check tool, a QA tool, if you will, to say, all right, here's the list of things I, as a researcher filling in trials, know I need to fill in. And so you can leverage rules from that perspective on the other side, and also be more consistent. So then all of the trials that you are filling in use that same list, that same checklist essentially, can be a great way to ensure that all of the trials that are being worked on will have those same most critical information filled in. So with that, I'm going to switch over to ARM and kind of just talk through what is a study rule. So I have a trial open here. Rules can exist in a protocol or a trial. Obviously, when you put a study rule into a protocol, then that will be distributed to all of the trials you generate. So that's a big bonus for that structure ARM provides with that protocol plan. I just happen to have this trial here, but really everything is going to apply more or less the same. So in this trial, I've got the treatments editor here loaded. When you do have a file that has study rules, you've may noticed already that ARM will automatically kind of split the screen for you. So whatever editor you typically are working on will be at the top half, but we'll also have the study rules panel at the bottom. And of course, you can always close that if you only want to look at the one. But here, since that's kind of our focus, I'll drag this panel up a little bit to look at our study rules. And you can notice that it's also a component here on our navigation bar to get to that if you're starting from scratch and there aren't any that fill in. So in this case, just looking at our editor here, we've got 3 study rules. The first one here is a required rule that states in the site description, specifically the specific field is the latitude, and peeking down at number 2, it'll be the longitude. We did kind of both of them together here. Both the latitude and the longitude for the trial need to be filled in. So we're requiring that information be filled in, and the established here condition matches up with the trial status. So once the trial status is set to established or later, then we need to have that information filled in. This third option here is a recommended rule that on the assessment data editor, the rating date should be filled in. And now that isn't necessarily related to the trial status, but that is when we put in assessment data for that particular column. And we can see that we're actually pointing to all columns, not just a particular assessment column, but all of our data columns should have that, has that rule applied. So that's what study rules will look like in a protocol or a trial. Just to dive in a little more specifically on those different components that we saw on the editor. That rule ID is really the name of the study rule, what it does. And we saw the required rule, those first two options there. Required and recommended are probably the most common ones that you'll use. And so required means I have to have this information filled in. The trial is not valid, and if this information, this field, whatever I've selected, is not filled in at the condition that I have defined. The recommended is a little less strict. So that's that second level that we mentioned earlier. So this means the trial may still be valid if you haven't filled this in. We're not going to stop the presses or anything like that. But if you have this information, I'd really like you to fill it in, is essentially the way to communicate that. And so this, we're saying that rating date, would really like it if you'd fill that in, but the show isn't going to stop just because you haven't filled that in. So kind of the difference between required and recommended, and we'll see that later on when we perform the validation step, exactly what that'll look like as the trialist is validating the study to make sure they've fit all of the rules. And we'll see that there's a slight difference in how those two types of rules are conveyed. So that's the rule ID. The editor in the field is just that location of what screen will you find it on, and specifically what box, what data entry field are we talking about that the rule has been applied to. Then the condition is really, when does this rule kick in, or maybe who does the rule apply to? So just depending on the rule type, that condition kind of points you to when does this kick in. So we saw the example with the trial status is a common one, but could also be in the assessment data, more common to once you've filled in data for a particular column. Now we assume the assessment has been performed, so the information that needs to be describing that assessment or documenting that assessment needs to get filled in now. So that's a common trigger as well for when the rule should happen. Because of course, if you haven't taken an assessment yet, it wouldn't make any sense that you should have to fill in a rating date yet. So there's kind of a time aspect to the rules of when it should happen, or maybe who, in some cases, as to who needs to fill it in or can't see the information, things like that. Then for some rules, depending on where they're located, you specify the assessment columns or maybe the treatment lines where that rule applies. So of course, like on the treatments editor, you don't need to have a rule that would just apply to every single treatment row, but you can be specific as to which components there on that screen the rule actually applies to. And then finally, the permissions. We didn't necessarily point that out on the ARM screen, but that is who can modify the rule. So if I go back here, that's the permission to edit rule over here. And so that's important when implementing the rule, to set who is able to edit the rule. So primarily being, if the option to delete it would be, I think, this most common case for that. And so when you add a rule yourself, you become the owner of that rule. And so your license GDM ID code is what we use there. You can find that in the help about ARM if you're curious what that is, but that's just linked to the licensee. And so you are the owner then of that rule because you have defined and created the rule. Then you can set who should be able to share that ownership to some extent, who has permissions to change this rule or to remove the rule. So from the sponsor trialist perspective, of course, if I'm the sponsor and I want to create my list of things that need to get filled in, would it make sense to have the trialist have the ability to delete that rule? Well, if I really want them to fill it in, I'm kind of defeating the purpose if they can just delete the rule if they don't want to. So just depending on the purpose of the rule and the situation for your trial, you can set that permissions to allow certain people to be able to change the rule or not. The best practice really is everyone in my company. That's usually the best practice. That way, if there is an issue with the rule, for whatever reason, this particular trial, I can't fill in that information, the trialist says, then they can send it to you or anyone else in the company, and the company could adjust that rule as needed in order to work around that situation. Otherwise, some of the other options there, let me just grab a rule here real quick just to show the other options that you can allow just the protocol owners. So that would be whoever created the protocol, and in the settings, there's an option to add a few other protocol owners, kind of narrowing down the scope of that. Or you can be as loose as possible and say anyone. So anyone who wants to remove this rule, if it's not working for them, would be able to do so. But the sweet spot's kind of that everyone in my company. So there's a little flexibility that they don't have to track down just one particular licensee in order to adjust the rule, without just giving everyone control of being able to do that. Let me delete that rule out of here. So that's really the structure of a rule. Kind of taking that one step further, then, as you can see, it's just going to depend a lot on your experiment as to what's important to you. Maybe the type of experiment, maybe the general class of experiments you might be in is going to kind of dictate what information matters and what doesn't. So it's great to go through and create rules for a particular trial, but then of course that can be time consuming to do repeat that same process over and over again. So we have rule sets in ARM to basically save that list of study rules so that you can use it again and again in other studies. So, once you kind of start to see the benefits of a rule in a particular trial, then it's like, okay, well, how can I use this everywhere without having to go through that process of creating more rules in every single trial? So this is a way to kind of automate that process, save some time so you're not having to manually add all of those rules every time. And then of course, it'll also standardize as well. So now you will have you can create that same list of rules for every trial or every protocol that's going out this year. Or if you have multiple people in your organization working on different experiments, now everyone can be using those same lists. So that's really taking this another step now that we've got our list of rules that matter to us. Here in this example, we like this list, or we can certainly add more. I guess to show maybe the easiest way to add a rule. A moment ago I picked from this list, but you can see if I'm doing like a required item, then you have to choose the editor. And if we're in like the site description, of course, you imagine the site description, how many different fields there are. This list is just massive. So it can be a little time consuming and really not the best way to add a rule is just to sit through this list and start adding a bunch. Really the best tactic, I just delete this rule out of here, would be to go through the screens of the trial and use the right click. Here my screen was split, so I'll just close that so we just see the one. So go through each section of the trial, and of course you kind of have that visual help to say, okay, what do I need here? What typically do I need to have filled in? So like the GPS accuracy, you can see that the rules we already have in place are actually highlighted. So the latitude and the longitude, they're not filled in yet. So those rules have not been satisfied, and they're then highlighted on the screen to draw attention that, hey, I need this information. So let's say maybe GPS accuracy would be a nice to have to pair with the GPS that we have to have. So you would just right click in the field that you're interested in. And then in the right click menu, it's the bottom section here. The last section of the right click is really all related to the study rules. So here I could add a recommended study rule. So that way we don't absolutely have to have the accuracy, but would be nice if the trialist could provide that. And then the sub options are really the different conditions. So what do we want to have here? Should they be immediately required to fill it in, or based on these different trial statuses, kind of at what point in the research study there should this information be known and thus filled in? So let's choose the established, since that was the same time frame as the latitude and longitude. As soon as the trial has been chosen for location, they should be able to know that GPS accuracy. So it's a little lighter here on my screen. It's a little hard to see. I don't know if it's just my monitor settings, but it is highlighted in a light blue. So there's two different color choices there for the required versus the recommended. But again, you can just kind of go through each section of a trial and look to see, okay, what information do we have to have for this type of study, and looking at all the different fields. Emergent state, we need to know that, and that'll be as soon as things are starting to happen in the trial. So it's interim, and nice to have this. I'm just going to kind of pick a few random ones here. We talked about the other types of studies. So so far I've just been picking required and recommended, but you'll notice in that right click that the bottom one here is you can also lock the field to prevent edits. So that one kind of lives as either required or recommended. So it kind of defines how locked down that field is. So if you choose the required and then lock that field, it will mean that this value absolutely cannot be changed. So in this case, the planting rate for whatever reason absolutely can't change. It has to be that way. As opposed to, I'm just going to take another value here. It might not make a lot of sense agronomically, but if I chose the recommended and then locked the field to prevent edits, then it's not going to prevent that value from being changed. But if the trialist tries to change that value, there'll be a prompt that comes up. And ARM will say, warning, there's a recommended rule to not change this value. So it's kind of an extra confirmation to say, hey, it's unusual that you would need to change this. Please make sure that it's valid that you're changing this. So that will be the difference between requiring that the value is locked, which means that it will not be able to be changed, versus a recommended. So here I'm just going to change that value to show that confirmation. So this says it's required. The required study rule locking the field is defined. So you cannot change the value. So it'll put it back the way it is. Here I'm the person who set that rule, so it's not too worried about letting me change it, but as the trialist, somebody else who didn't put that rule in will not be able to change it. Whereas here, if I change that value, it allows me to. There should still be a prompt. Again, I think since I'm that same person who put in the rules, then it's not prompting me like it would for somebody who isn't the study rule owner. So going back to the study rules, you can just see our list has grown here. And so really, again, the goal is you spend some time going through a trial of a particular type and say, all right, these are the things we need to have. These are the things we want to have. Now let's save this list. So that way we can use it in another study that's similar. So to do that on this study rules editor, there's a button at the bottom to save a rule set. So this is a lot like a print settings where you can save your report set, or a lot of the other components of ARAN where you do something and then we can encapsulate those decisions you made into a file then that can be loaded again and again. So you can do the same thing across multiple studies or across multiple people. So we'll save, the rule set has a file extension of RLS, doesn't really matter. In particular, really here we can just give this a name. So I'm just going to call it our webinar rules, but of course you'd want to give it something that's descriptive of what you're trying to save. So maybe it's our herbicide study on soybeans, or whatever category you would put this in to remind yourself later, what does this rule set apply to? Maybe it's all of them. I went through and thought just rules that for every single trial that's done, this stuff is needed. So maybe I would call it baseline. This is our baseline set. I'll just throw on the word webinar since we're in a session here. But give that file a name that will help you or others recognize when to use it and how it would matter. So that will save that file. ARM also offers to save a description. So you could be a little more long-winded with reminding what this should be for. So, in our case, maybe rules that should be used for all studies run by my company here, which we don't do any research, but gives you a way to make a longer description to remind yourself of what the purpose was for that set. So now that file is saved onto my computer, so I can use it again and again. So now if I am working on, maybe I'll just create a new protocol here. And I won't save any changes to this particular trial, but now maybe I'm working on another protocol. It's very similar to that other trial. I can go into the study rules editor, and I can use that rule set by loading that file. So here I called it baseline webinar. You can see there's that text that we wrote to ourselves to remind ourselves when we should use it. So when I say okay, it's going to load in that list. Just the very same selections that we made in that previous trial now are here to be used in this protocol and all of its trials. So a great way to save time and to standardize. That file that's living on my computer, I could send that in an email to a colleague. I could put it out on our network. So everyone that's using ARM could find that. If you notice when we're loading the rule set, it starts by default in that local folder. But if I had to, I could certainly find a network drive and connect up to that if I wanted to find the whole group's study rules that we've created. So that's the rule set. That's really I think almost a requirement for using rules as far as saving time. So you're not traipsing through every single trial to decide, making those same decisions again and again of what matters and what doesn't. And the nice thing is you can really kind of adopt a system specific to whatever the types of research you're working on, because you can load more than one rule set into a particular study. So rules really are additive. If I load another set, let me just do that quickly here. We've put in this one set, but if I wanted to bring in another set of rules, I could grab another one here. So here I've got, this is probably from another webinar of a baseline, or maybe I've created one for serials. So I can say okay there, and this will add more study rules to my list. So now we're up to 14. And you'll notice when you're clicked into a particular rule at the top, it'll tell you what rule set that came from. So if you're not quite sure, why did this get added? Here we've got all this information about the crop description. Well, that came from the rule set that we had specified are required for serial type of studies. Whereas up here, this was our baseline. The rating date was in our baseline set. So these rules and bringing in rule sets really are additive, but you can't contradict yourself either. So in this logic, ARM will just take care of automatically when it's loading in a rule set. So let's say that first baseline set has a the required GPS field, just like we had in our example. You can't come in and load a different rule set that maybe only recommends GPS. That's kind of a weaker rule, if you will, less strict. When you add that second rule, ARM is going to see that there's already a more strict rule. So there's no way we're going to loosen up that restriction just because you brought in a set that has a rule that's less strict. So as a result, you're always going to get the strictest version of the rule. Whichever rule was more strict is going to win in that case. So in the end, the trial is going to have a required rule for that GPS field, and the recommended just won't even be added. So no way to get around a rule that you put in place. Also, hopefully, just a nice pat on the back for creating rules that you can't mess up. The wrong combination of rule sets I load could create a loophole or anything like that. ARM will do that automatically as you're adding the rules to make sure they coalesce nicely and fairly without creating a hole or anything too. So another benefit of that would be for the trialist. So if the protocol writer has some rules filled in, but then again, as an individual trialist, I've got my own set. As we mentioned earlier, maybe that's my QA of sorts that I want to make sure that all of my trials have the bare minimum that I want. When I receive a trial as a trialist, even if there's rules present, I can load in my own, knowing that that's not going to mess up any of the validation for the protocol. Their requirements will for sure still be in place. And then just on top of that, I'll have my own set. If there's additional things that ARM should check, now both of those sets of checks essentially will be in place for me in that study. So I think that's really some powerful aspects of rules as you get going. As we mentioned, for a beginner, of course, you know you're not going to, the very first time you start to work the rules, you're not going to build 4 rule sets just out of the gates. You know, really a matter of just getting a feel for them, looking at a trial and making those decisions the first time, and then maybe that second time through might have a slightly different feel to it. You get more confident in what you've seen, or thinking about, well, last year, you know, if you're the sponsor getting data back, well, last year we had to ask for this information to like 4 different trialists. They kept forgetting to put it in. Well, let's put that in as a study rule. So you can kind of have knowledge kind of adding on and on as you do more trials come in. You can kind of get that pattern of what's missing or not quite right, and then implement that as a study rule so that next year those problems don't happen. They can be caught in the validation by the trialists. So some kind of some practical tips and tricks, if you will, for really getting going with rules. First suggestion would be, you know, if you're kind of in the beginning of the season here, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, things are starting to get rolling. You can use last year's trial to build the rules list. So really, you know, as we saw in ARM, it worked very well to use the right-click menu to add rules. The trouble with protocol writing then is you don't see everything that's in the trial. You know, especially the protocol description is fairly different. There's, you know, a lot of this information also exists in the trial, but there's no, you know, application date. There's literally not that field, because in a protocol, you're not filling in a date at all. So there's no way to require an application date, or, you know, there's quite a few fields that aren't visible in the protocol, but once you get to that trial, now all of the fields are there. So really the best way to add rules isn't to click through a protocol necessarily, but open up a trial. And if you use last year's trial, you know, those hangups and issues, maybe things you had to ask for again and again type of thing, might be kind of fresh in your memory then, since it's just last year's study. And you can go ahead and right click and add all of those rules to that file, and then save that set. Just like we did today here, save that set, then you can even close that trial without saving the changes and discard those rules. But now you've created that rule set that then can be implemented in this year's trials or this year's protocols that will go out as trials. So that's really the best way to get rolling, is have a trial open, and last year's trial might trigger some of those sticking points and you know, which are perfect things for study rules then, to make sure the trialist knows that this has to get filled in, or don't touch this thing. This value shouldn't change, things like that. The next tip we kind of hinted at a little bit as showing the study rule sets, that you can really create layers of sets. And again, it would be really, you know, particular to the type of research that you do, or maybe the different types of research that you do, how you would want to structure it. But what I see often is that there's usually kind of a baseline, a master set of rules that would just apply to no matter what research I do. This, you know, set of information should be true. This stuff should be filled in. the GPS coordinates was one example. The rating date. If you take an assessment, I need to have the rating date. That's absolutely critical for no matter what type of study it is. So you have this list of things that doesn't matter what type of study, this has to be true, this needs to be filled in, it needs to be this way. Those types of things really create a nice master set that every single study that our company ever puts out needs to have. So let's use that as this baseline or this master set of rules. Then we can kind of make another pass through our trials and think, all right, for this particular type of study, what do we need to have? So that was my example here when we loaded that second rule set, and I had cereals in the name. So I created the master set. That was the baseline of what we absolutely had to have. And now I can have for each discipline, perhaps, or for each, maybe it's for each crop, that we work on here in our company, kind of has their own flavor, own types of things that need to be filled in. Or maybe it's a particular product. When that product is involved, there's a certain set of information that's really important to get. So again, the structure of what what groups, what categories you create would really be unique to what you are doing, but the concept of building these different sets, I think, is universal, and it really would just depend on what works for your group, what makes the most sense. But leverage that capability of loading in sets so that way you can make those decisions just once and save it to a file that then can be implemented again and again, and also across your different people. Another trick that we touched on a little bit when we were talking about the different types of rules is really to start simple. The first year going with rules, you probably aren't going to have 250 rules in every file. Out here, we just canvassed everything, and there's colors all over the trial because we've had rules in everything. Really, it's better to start small and start simple, and then you can build each year. So we've just seen in some cases, the sponsor or the protocol writer gets maybe a little trigger happy, and then all of a sudden in the trialist is having troubles. I can't put this information in, or I'm trying to change this. I need to put this in, but there's a study rule that won't let me change it. Things like that. So I think it's best to try to start simple, and just be confident in those decisions you're making as to this value. If, for example, if you're going to lock a field, okay, I cannot think of a valid scenario where this value would be changed. There's that one year, if something like that pops in your head, okay, well, maybe this shouldn't be required to be locked. Well, let's make it recommended instead. So, leverage that recommended option gives the trialist flexibility. You can still communicate to them, in the locked field example, there's still that communication of this value should not change. This is important to us for this experiment, but it doesn't prevent them from changing it if something happened, if it needed to be different. So that can be your friend as you start out. And then as you gain more experience with those rules and find out that in this case, for whatever example it may be, that worked really well, or that didn't, that just confused people more. Maybe we shouldn't have that rule at all. Or maybe we need to make that more strict because then we ended up with a mess and they were changing it when they really even shouldn't have, or whatever. Then the next year, you can just go through that same process to look at your list of rules and review it and say, okay, that worked well, this didn't so much. I think we need to add these other rules. And essentially, when you go and do that, if you're just in a new protocol, empty protocol or whatever, let me just delete all these rules out. Then you can load that set. So here's that baseline. Now we're in year 2, we look over it again and say, okay, you know, that was great, but this one really confused people. Even though we only made it recommended, and people were all flustered by it and were asking questions and caused more problems. So let's just delete that rule. Maybe there's one more we want to add. I'll just do the limit validation list just because I know that fills it in. So make any adjustments, and then you would just save that rule set, and you can just save it right over the top. And that will keep the same name, but replace that file with the newer version so that, and maybe I'll put in my year, you know, edited 2022. So you can remind yourself, yeah, this is the newer one for this year's study, since the last year we kind of built upon. So you can evolve it. It's not going to be a concrete thing that once you've set it, it's done, and you can never change those rules. You can learn and build each year as you go, and then really evolve those rules. If you're working with a group of ARM users, you know, we mentioned that the files are nice and flexible to send to others, so people can use those same rule set. It might be advantageous to even create those sets together. You know, sit down or connect all on Zoom and walk through at last year's trial and talk through it together as you're making those decisions of what happened. And create the company-wide baseline set, the company-wide serial study, the company-wide fungicide, you know, whatever you're going to do, you can, you know, I think it really having that collective experiences put together can really jumpstart the sets that you're creating. So everyone who's had that one-off scenario that caused a bunch of trouble can chime in when you're adding those rules. Ooh, let's not make that required. That's going to be a headache for, you know, this type of study or whatever. Yeah, the more people with experience with ARM working on trials that can be in that same decision-making process can really bolster those sets and make it more valuable and flexible for your group. Then finally, if you're in the middle of the season now, or somebody's watching this recording and they're like, oh, well, this is way too late. The protocol is written and the trials are halfway done. You know, you don't have to sit on the sideline and say, well, we'll remember this for next year. You can still create the rule set, even if you didn't put it in the protocol. So, you know, all the here sitting as the sponsor and say, boy, this would have been great to know before I sent out all of those. It's too late for me now. Well, still go through that process and create the rule set. And then when you receive the interim data from the trial list, when you open that trial, you can then load your rule set and then validate. And so even though the trialist might not have had that rule set, so they didn't necessarily know they had to fill it in, it will save you time as you're getting all that data back to run that validation, to run those rules and see what was missed. And then of course you can reply, you know, send back to that trialist what was missing. Depending on how savvy that trialist is with ARM, you could send that RLS to them. Say, hey, you know, we're a little behind, but I've got a rule set for you if you want to use this. And they could use it in their trial then from that mid-season on. So certainly don't sit on the sidelines the whole year. At least leverage that, even if it's just internally as you're getting the data back, to have ARM check for that, check that information. So the last section, kind of an optional one for me to cover. So I just wanted to take a quick break to see if there were questions before kind of moving to that last section. You know, kind of went fast with the rules. I try not to dive too deep into all of the options within the rules. That makes for a pretty good kind of advanced webinar, if you will, talking through all the different items in the dropdown and what you can do with them. If you kind of want to know some of your options, you can find in the help menu, we have a list of all the items. Of course, now my help always disappears when I have my, I have a separate monitor for, see if maximizing, there we go. Separate monitor for doing the webinar, and then the window always ends up in the abyss somewhere. But we do have a list of all of the rules. So the available study rules, we'll just actually go through kind of each different option, whether it's the rule or the condition, things like that, and kind of talk through all the different options. There's quite a few. There's, I would say, the top 25% probably are kind of the most common ones you'll use a lot. And then there's some kind of one-offs that you'll see in this list farther down that's pretty specific. There's one company doing this one type of thing where they had this situation where they really needed to have this rule. And then it's like, okay, we'll add it. Can't really see that the masses are going to use it, but in this one case, it might be handy. So there's some rules like that that are maybe less common than others. But that's a good resource just to get going if you want to know what's out there. But by and large, the bulk of it is, here's a value that needs to get filled in, required, recommended, or here's a value that shouldn't change, and let's lock it down, are the big ones. All right, well, not seeing any questions. I'll kind of pivot over to the validation then. So this really is kind of the other side of the study rules. We've filled in the rules. We have this list of things that have to happen or that should happen. And then once you get to the trial, and now we're filling in the trial, what does this look like? So I'm just going to open up this trial here that's kind of mocked up with some specific examples of us not quite achieving all of the study rules we want. So in this case, I've got 4 study rules, and you can actually tell already we've got 0 out of 4 completed. So this is kind of a rigged trial for us to fail everything essentially, to show what it'll look like. And really this process here, let me go back to our slide just to lay the foundation here. Validation is the tool in ARM to basically have ARM check for the list of rules. Let's have ARM look through this trial that's open and see if we've accomplished all of our requirements that have been given to us in the study rules. So kind of here's the checklist of what ARM does when we trigger this validation process. First, it'll refresh any values in the trial that are automatically calculated. So something like you've chosen your crop code, so then the crop name and description, that can change depending on what language you're in. Things like that will be refreshed. A calculated interval in the assessment data. Your rating date you have, then it's okay, what was the interval from the last application? Things like that are all recalculated to make sure that's accurate for any changes that could have happened in the trial. Then there's some cross checks that ARM does automatically. So not a particular study rule that you've defined, but they're just kind of built-in checking that ARM will do for you. So something like the unit value pairs, if you're in the treatments editor and you put in the rate, but you forget to put in the rate unit, or the crop density, something like that, you're supposed to fill in. I put in my unit, but I forgot to put in the value. Well, you need to have both. So ARM will check, and if one of those is missing, that'll be flagged as an error that has to get filled in. There's some dates as well, and I've got an example of that too, of just logical. Oh, you have this, application happening before the trial is ever set up, or you have a rating date that is after your completion date. Things like that just logically don't make any sense. ARM tries to catch. those situations and let you know that there's kind of a mismatch. This doesn't make sense logically as to when things should be occurring. Obviously, it can't know for a fact when a particular assessment happened, but can just catch some of those relative, logical things based on the different dates in the trial. And then the big point of the validation is to verify the study rules. Okay, which rules do we have in the study, and are they being met? Have we filled in all of those values that are have been defined? So that's the user-defined study rules that we have in the list. There may also be some rules in your study definition. For the standard screens, there are very, very little. There's almost nothing there. But if you are working on one of the global sponsors, some of them have their own customized versions of ARM, and there might be some rules baked in there that come out to the forefront in this validation. So all of this is done here with just a couple of mouse clicks. So back in ARM here, we can perform this validation from the tools menu. We can validate trial. So this will perform those steps just like we said. And as soon as it runs into an issue, ARM will stop the checking and tell us what's the problem. So in this case, it says there's a required field in the treatments editor, the formulation concentration on treatment line 5. Okay, not sure what I did in my treatment editor. Nice thing is then ARM will take us right to that value. So it will bring us right to the treatments editor, line number 5. And here I can see that it wasn't that we had a specific study rule that said you need to fill in the formulation. This was that value unit pair. Okay, I have a formulation unit, but I managed to leave out the number. Probably not something a trialist would encounter. You probably most likely filled in the treatments already, but just to kind of show that example here. So I can make that correction and then just perform the validation again. All right, let's run through those checks. It'll get farther in the process here until it runs into another error and can tell us here now that in the assessment data header, we have a required field that's not filled in. So the rating date in data column number 1 is empty. And according to study rule number 1, it needs to be filled in. So we can see this wasn't an internal check, but kind of an external one from our sponsor to say this has to get filled in. So once again, ARM will bring us to the location of that missing information or the issue that's at hand. So then we can see that, yep, we forgot to put in a rating date for column number 1. So here it looks like we're in 2019. So I'm just going to copy this date and put it in here. So that way we can satisfy that study rule. Oops. So we can continue that process of validating and stepping through each issue. If you're that trialist and you can fix those issues, that's a great way to have ARM just kind of hold your hand and walk you through the trial of which problems are there. Let's get them fixed. If you're the sponsor or maybe not the person that would necessarily be able to make those changes, but you do want to check out to see what problems exist, there's a second type of validation here. You can validate trial and just log the errors. So this will have ARM go through the entire set of validation. And when it comes across an issue, instead of just stopping, it'll put that in a log and then continue through and make a list of all of the issues that are currently present in the study. So here now we get a list of all of the issues. Study rule number 1, 2, and 3 are all not being met, and they tell you where in the study that needs to get changed. I've also got kind of a weird thing going on with the dates, and then there's also a warning. So a real quick aside here to point out that these were all listed as errors. These are required fields that have been defined. If you choose to make a study rule that's recommended, you'll notice that that comes in as a warning. So in our example, we had a recommended study rule in the site description for that GPS accuracy. So it's not going to say this trial is invalid, it's failed validation, but there is this one thing to note. And so it comes in as a warning to say that this, since it's recommended, you're not strictly required to do it. It's okay if you can't fill it in, but I'm going to let you know, I'm going to remind you that this is here because it's been highlighted as somewhat important, but not critical. So that's the difference between that decision making of should I make the rule required or recommended? Is it invalid if it's empty, not filled in, or is it just preferred but not required? So the nice thing with this list here, this logging of the errors, that scenario we mentioned a moment ago, it's mid-season, I forgot to put in the rules, I'm getting all these trials back. This can be a great way to save the sponsor time when you're getting all that data back, is let's load the rule set and then let's validate and log the errors. And now I can take this list and send it back to the trialist. Say, hey, I'm missing this information that I really need from you. Can you fill this in? Really save that manual looking through all the trials and trying to catch what isn't there yet as you're getting the interim data back. This can really automate that process and really speed it up because it's just a few clicks to load that rule set and have ARM automate that process of looking through the trial to catch those things. So you can look at that list and there's actually a clipboard button right at the bottom here. And that will copy all of this information to give a nice simple list. And then you could create an email. I'm just going to open up Word, just a little easier to visualize, but just create a new email or reply back to that trialist who just sent that to you. And I can just paste in that text from the ARM validation. And I could clean it up and say, here are issues that need to be resolved. Clean it up a little bit or however you'd want, but a nice simple list of these are the things failed based on the rules that I have set out. So just a great way to really save some time and have ARM do all the heavy lifting, that work of scanning through the trials. Let's do that once, create our list of rules, do that once manually, using our experience with trials and the common pitfalls, create that list, and now have ARM do that lifting on every single trial as you're getting them back. So that's the validation here. Just to show here, since I have just another minute, I'll just finish these. So here we have more of those rating date fields. I'll just even enter today's date with the space bar just because I want to get that done. Validate to see the next message. So this one is required GPS coordinates. So that'll bring us to the site description to say, hey, you didn't fill in the GPS coordinates, you have to do that. So let me fill in my coordinates here for our trial site. That'll be close enough. We'll leave the accuracy empty just so we can see when we get down to the end of the list how that comes in this kind of 1-by-1 case. So we're just kind of continuing on. Last one here is that date consistency, if you will, and it's telling us that the initiation date is set to April 2019, but that's later than the application date. So one of the applications occurred in May of 2018, but we said the trial itself starts in 2019. So how can that be possible? You can't have an application that occurred before the trial occurred. So we can see in that case, it's not super clear. ARM can't just take us, it's either could take us to the initiation date or maybe it's the application date that's wrong. ARM doesn't know for sure which value is wrong, but one of the two isn't making any sense. So it can't just take us right to there, but it can give us that error message. And so in my case, as you saw, the assessments were done in 2019. This should be 2019. So they just entered in the wrong date. It's the end of March, but I'm still writing 2021 on checks. So I can associate with that error there. So now we fixed that issue. Let's validate once again. Now we're done with the errors. We've fit all the errors and fixed all of those. So now we're down to just the last recommended rule. So again, this is showing us that recommended rule, but now we don't have any errors. So we're actually valid. I probably clicked on that button without even thinking. When we validate, now it's just letting us know there's no errors. We only have a recommended rule. So that may or may not need to get filled in. Maybe I can't fill it in. But there are no more errors. So this is a valid trial. And I am able to send it off now, per se, that we've passed validation. And of course, I could go in and fill in the accuracy. This is not nearly 5-meter accuracy, but it's good enough. Once we filled it in, then if you're able to, just to show all the way done, there's not a single study rule that has any issues, anything to let us know. Now we get a confirmation that the trial is valid. There isn't anything we have not filled in. All right. Well, that's our time. Hopefully we gave some tips and tricks to get going, at least on study rules. Give it a try if you haven't before. Like I said, start small, and it can grow as you get more comfortable with it. But I think it can really save you a lot of time and boost the quality of trials. So let us know if you have any troubles, whether you're getting started or if it's in the middle of the season and the trialist is coming back with an error they don't understand or whatever. Let us know, and we can kind of help out and either explain to the trialist what's going on, or help work through what was maybe wrong in the setting up of the study rule, and kind of figure out if there is any issue. But they usually go pretty smoothly. Hopefully the messaging in ARM is nice and clear to that trialist to know what they need to do. So thanks, everyone.